In an earlier video, my video on ye old diseases, I mentioned scurvy, um, how it was at one time considered to be a pox. Poxes are generally viral in nature. Scurvy is due to malnutrition, and so it's not technically a pox, but it was originally considered one because it had all the symptoms of a pox. And since then, I've just sort of been stumbling across, news articles and other things just referring to malnutrition. So I figured, okay, we talked about scurvy. Let's do a video on malnutrition. And I started doing some research on it, and scurvy really blew up as the main one. There was a lot on scurvy. So I decided, okay, I'm going to do scurvy gets its own video, and then I will follow up with some other malnutritious, diseases based on malnutrition afterwards. So there have been various names for scurvy over the years: Muller's disease, Chatel's disease, Barlow's disease. Scorbutus is the Latin for it, which comes up in some of the future of it. And then also I think the common, the technical modern name is hypoascorbemia, which is basically a fancy way of saying lack of vitamin C. Hypo means less than normal. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C, so that's where that comes from. Now, a lot of, basically Wikipedia was a good source for information up to a point, and, especially looking at the history of scurvy. So a lot of what I'm going to say is basically stuff I got straight from Wikipedia. However, I'm going to question some of it as I go through it, just because I did follow up, my own personal studies, my own experiences in the past where scurvy's come up, has differed from what Wikipedia says. So where my information differs from Wikipedia, I went online and I did a little more digging. And so, as I will point out, scurvy is generally associated with sailors, because again, lack of vitamin C, you're out to sea for a long time, and so, long ocean voyage, you pack what food you can pack, and most of them were lacking in vitamin C. That is not to say that sailors were the only people who got scurvy, but it was they were the main people to suffer from it, or probably the majority of people to suffer from it. So my interest in scurvy comes more from, I have a past interest in sailing. I don't sail myself, but ships and all, and the history of ships and the history of exploration has always been interesting. So I look at scurvy, as a, or I have some past experience with scurvy just due to past interest in ships and what went on ships, because you can't read a book about ships or old ships without coming across reference to scurvy, it seems like. So that's another reason why, I feel somewhat authorized to question a single online source. If I can find multiple online sources that disagree with me, then okay, I will go along with the fact that maybe I was wrong. And even when I disagree with Wikipedia, I'm not just going to say, Wikipedia is wrong. I actually looked up some stuff to find out if they were right or not, just to be fair. So there have been references to scurvy, supposedly, first off, again, scurvy is a lack of vitamin C, or deficiency of vitamin C. It causes weakness, it causes sores to form, bleeding gums, stuff like that. Basically, your body uses vitamin C to make collagen, and collagen is sort of the stuff that, sort of the one of the main tissues that the body is made up of, or one of the, I guess, main substances that tissues are made up of. So you don't get vitamin C, your body can't make collagen. As your body deteriorates, it can't repair itself, and you start to basically get sores all over yourself. And so that said, historically, the word scurvy, I think I mentioned it on the last video, comes from about 1600s, 1700s in Germany. So ancient times, we believe people had scurvy, but we're basing it on a description of symptoms as opposed to, any text saying this guy had scurvy. So the ancient Greeks and the ancient Egyptians both had records of people suffering from scurvy-like conditions. The Egyptians especially, we sort of know their diet fairly well, and we know that they would from time to time have periods of low vitamin C producing it. They had fruits and stuff, but they relied a lot on grains sometimes, or depending on. We know from their diet that they from time to time got away from the vitamin C rich foods. So that's believable. The Greeks, it's a little harder. Mediterranean area, they get a lot of fruits and vegetables growing there. So it's a little harder to believe that maybe the scurvy that they were suffering could have been something different, and it just different symptoms that looked like scurvy. But it's also possible, scurvy has been on and off throughout the world. So yeah, it's possible they had scurvy. Again, they didn't call it scurvy. That's the main thing. And so when we look at the ancient world and said they had scurvy, we're looking at their description and then following up with, okay, what could this have been based on what they're describing? And scurvy seems to fit in a lot of cases. Now, in the 5th century, there was a Buddhist monk named Faxian. He's famous for traveling from China to India in order to collect Buddhist texts, which he later translated into Chinese. According to Wikipedia, he wrote that Chinese sailors would take ginger in order to fight scurvy. So the Chinese ships, they'd load up with a supply of ginger. So this is interesting, because again, we are back to the point of he spoke Chinese and Sanskrit, well, Indian, and various dialects there. They didn't use the word ginger, or they didn't use the word scurvy. So was he just describing a disease or not? Faxian, he is most famous for his main writing, or the only writing I could find attributed to him was, what was that? The Fogyoji, or A Record of Buddhistic Kingdoms, as some people translated in English. So I looked this up online. I found a copy in Project Gutenberg, and I looked through, and I looked for references to ginger and references to scurvy, and couldn't find any. I looked for references of sailors getting sick, and couldn't find any. I looked up, illness and disease in general, and couldn't find any references to it. So if he did write about ginger and scurvy, it wasn't in this writing. It is possible, again, he was translating a bunch of texts from India, so it's possible that one of them mentioned ginger being used by sailors to cure a disease like scurvy, and people just attributed this as his personal writings as opposed to a translation he made. Again, can't prove that one way or the other. Um, but that's a possible, or it's possible that Wikipedia source was just wrong on this one. Like I said, my purpose here is not to criticize Wikipedia overly much, but it's to not just quote them repeatedly as I go through this list, and to show that I did put a little more thought into this than just Wikipedia says. Now the Crusaders suffered from scurvy in the 13th century, according to this. Again, that's believable. They would have been talking in Latin, so they might have mentioned, scorbutus or whatever the Latin. Let me look that up real quick. Yes, scorbutus, which was the Latin term for it. So it is very possible that they described scurvy and actually used a word that we can link back to scurvy. The age of sail, of course, well, skip the age of sail now. So medieval Europe, they had bouts of scurvy going on basically during the winter time. The main cause of scurvy again is you're eating, or you're not eating enough vitamin C. So wintertime comes along, you're reliant on meats and on your stores of grain more than you are on vegetables. So people would get scurvy throughout the Middle Ages, on and off. And they probably looked at it as a seasonal thing. We have flu season. They would have had scurvy season. They might not have called it scurvy, but they knew there was this disease that came during the winter time. And so, interesting thing. Again, according to Wikipedia, when potatoes were introduced to Europe from the Americas, scurvy on the mainland almost disappeared completely, because you have this thing which it's got vitamin C, it can be stored readily well, so as long as the potato crop was doing well, incidence of scurvy dropped. Of course, people didn't necessarily eat the potatoes, they ate whatever they wanted, so some people still could have gotten it, but it wasn't as big a problem as it was back in the days of, before the potato. And then we hit, of course, the age of sail. Scurvy becomes a big deal again because now we have people getting on ships. They are packing the foods which are more convenient to pack on ships, we want a lot of bang for our buck, so we can live longer on grains, dried meats, whatever, than we can on vegetables. Vegetables have to be stored for, they have to keep, they spoil easier than these other foods. So people are taking less fruits and vegetables with them just because they don't last as long. And turns out the people didn't last as long when they weren't eating the fruits and vegetables. It is estimated that about 50% of sailors were expected to die from scurvy on ships. And again, that was an expectation. You set out, you expected to come back with only half your crew. So I didn't find any reference that says 50% did die, just that 50% were expected to die. Now, we get to the interesting thing is people started to find cures for scurvy. So the Portuguese discovered that lemons and other tropical fruits were good for scurvy, to fight scurvy. They actually planted, Pedro Alvarez Cabral was a Portuguese scholar who wrote about he specifically wrote about the curative effects of fruits and vegetables, citrus fruits on scurvy. He wrote this in about 1507, according to Wikipedia. So one thing that the Portuguese did was on St. Helena, an island off the coast of Africa, they planted fruit trees. And what they would do is, as they would sail around, they'd stop at St. Helena, drop off anyone who was suffering from scurvy or showed signs of scurvy, pick up anyone from the last trip who was left behind on the last trip, so they restock their crew. So now you have one set of men left on the island to recuperate, another set of men who have recuperated, ready to take their place, and they were basically cycling through their men, which worked for them for a while, so it wasn't a bad plan. So they didn't really have a hospital set up, but they had a little community set up where people could recuperate, and there would be some healthy people to tend to the trees and take care of the people. And that worked for them. 1536, Jacques Cartier, who was exploring the St. Lawrence River, his men started to suffer from scurvy. Native American cure was given to them. Basically, it was a pine needle tea, or it was a tea made of pine needles, or some sort of nettle tea, and again, gave them vitamin C. They didn't know that it was a vitamin C curing, but they did know that this stuff worked. And so we had the Native Americans are familiar with scurvy. They had a cure for it as well. And so they passed this on to this French explorer. We had 1579, a Augustin Farfan, a monk, published that using oranges and lemons to fight scurvy worked. And based on his writings, we know that the Spanish Navy was already knew that oranges and lemons could fight scurvy. This 1593, Admiral Richard Hawkins advocates the use of citrus juice to fight scurvy. 1601, James Lancaster. He had 4 ships. He was traveling to Sumatra from England. He stopped at Madagascar and loaded up with lemons and limes and stuff, citrus fruits. And so he decided to do an experiment. His plan was, he had 4 ships, so he only gave the fruit to men on one ship, and the others didn't get the fruit. And basically experimenting on his men. The guys on the ship that got the fruit got no scurvy. The other 3 ships started developing scurvy. Now this is sort of the first time where fruit was used as a preventive measure. The weird thing is they didn't keep doing it for whatever reason. He wrote about it. They didn't continue to do this. 1614, John Woodall. He was a Surgeon General for the East India Company. Suggested fresh food, if not available citrus fruit, prevented scurvy, although he couldn't give an explanation why. The prevailing thoughts at this time was that scurvy was due to a digestive disorder, and so he advocated fresh foods, fresh fruits and vegetables, and that was his contribution. So in 2009, someone discovered it was like a woman's household tips, something you might get in, Home and Garden magazine type thing. All these like how to run your household. This was written by a Cornish woman back in 1707, and she had a cure for scurvy. Which was basically high in vegetables and greens and fruits. And again, that wasn't her intent on writing. The book was for basically general household preparedness and stuff, and it just included this. So it showed that scurvy still did exist at this time. Even if you weren't sailing, even though it wasn't as common as it had been prior to the invention of the potato. 1734, Johann Bachstrom suggests that abstinence from vegetables is the cause of scurvy. This is like the first time someone actually stumbled across the actual cause of they knew the cure, they didn't know the cause. And no one, people weren't ready to take the leap that if we start taking the cure in advance, then maybe we won't suffer from scurvy later on. Makes a little sense. You take an aspirin when you get a headache. So if you want to avoid headaches, do you take aspirin on a daily basis, or one aspirin an hour or whatever? And modern day doctors would look at this and say, no, that's a bad plan. You shouldn't take medicine when you don't need it. And so, just because fruit and vegetable cure scurvy doesn't mean that you should take it as a preventive method. However, for the first time, we have someone saying maybe we should start taking, maybe the lack of vegetables is the cause of the scurvy, and we should start taking them. It didn't catch on, so his contribution fell flat. However, it wasn't too much further. About 30 years later, James Lind, actually less than that, but James Lind, 1753, does an experiment to show that a lack of citrus fruit, a lack of vegetables, a lack of fruits can cause scurvy. So this is like the first actual experimental proof. Even then, nobody does anything about it. It got published, it was read, people accepted it, but they didn't do anything about it. Then 1764, two doctors, David McBride and John Pringle, come up with the idea that scurvy is caused by unfixed gases in the tissues, whatever that means. Remember, Lind proved that eating vegetables and fruits will prevent you from getting shingles. He still didn't prove the cause of it. And so people are still looking for a cause of it, and these guys come up with this weird explanation. And so their suggested cure was take malt and wort. This will ferment in your system, it'll release gases, and that'll bring back your balance of, these fixed gases in your tissues will be balanced out by this. And people accepted it. Because again, so while Lind had come up with a good way to prevent it, he hadn't come up with the cause of it. And so people were thinking, if we find the actual cause to it, maybe there's a better preventive method to take. And this was the one they suggested. So, 1768 to 1771, James Cook circumnavigates the world in this endeavor. This is where things start to get shaky. So, went to Australia a few years back. They had a remake of the Endeavour, a reconstruction of it. Went on board, listened to the lectures on it. Again, I'm interested in ships. So, one thing Cook did was he took sauerkraut on board. Again, it's sauerkraut, it's preserved vegetables, So it's sauerkraut. It's a means of preserving vegetables. You can do it in concentration, so it's not taking up as much volume as it does on your ship, and your other things would on your ship. He made his trip around the world with no cases of scurvy. However, he also took molten wort along. He had heard about this molten wort cure. He took it along. He attributed the molten wort to the reason for not getting scurvy and not the sauerkraut. And that is one thing. If on the lecture, the guy giving the lecture said, "Oh, he took sauerkraut to fight scurvy," and not necessarily, because at the end of his voyage, he attributed the success to something other than sauerkraut. Now, Wikipedia mentions this. They mentioned that he took several cures, and they include the sauerkraut. They also include beer as one of the cures he took. Now, my problem with this is Cook was sort of a health fanatic, so he was good. He was big on nutrition. He was big on cleanliness, and so he wouldn't have wanted his sailors getting drunk. So giving beer as a cure was not a good idea. Also, the tour I took of the Endeavour, they mentioned that he took, he wasn't taking beer on board. What he was doing was he was throwing yeast in the water. Long sea voyage, fresh water is a commodity. You don't want your water to go stagnant. So they put yeast in the water the yeast would ferment, it would stir the water up, it would keep from stagnating. And so you would get, your water would last longer, wouldn't develop diseases as long. And so the fermented yeast was turning the water to beer. And so that's what the men were drinking. So the idea that she took beer along to test to see if it would cure scurvy or prevent scurvy, I lean away from that, just because, again, his purpose wasn't to take beer. His purpose was to keep the water fresh. Although, again, with the whole molten wort theory, it's understandable that some people would have thought beer was a cure. So, like I said, I'm thinking Cook leaned more. He took the cure with him by accident, not as a cure, in my opinion. I could be wrong on that. 1795, Gilbert Blaine convinces the Royal Navy to follow up on Lynn's stuff and to give the men lemon juice. So the Royal Navy starts getting lemon and lime juice based on, he still don't know the cause of scurvy, but he manages to convince them we're going to get less scurvy if we give the people lime juice and lemon juice. So English sailors become known as limeys because of this. That's why I sort of jump back and forth between lemon and lime here. But so again, we don't know the cause, but we're willing to start taking the cure as a preventive measure rather than just waiting till we get scurvy and then taking it. And it should be understood, citrus fruits, again, didn't grow all over the world. They were rare. You had to preserve them. So it is understandable why people just didn't load up on citrus fruits, because they didn't have the preservation means we have today. So, but as time went by, eventually they started doing this. 1901 to 1904, skipping ahead. So, early 1800s, Napoleon is going through Europe, ransacking places, etc. His men start to suffer from scurvy. Wartime, vegetables are scarce. They eat horse meat to cure it. Now, fresh meat will have vitamin C in it. Not a lot, not as much as fruits and vegetables, but it has vitamin C in it. So wartime, fruits and vegetables are scarce, they're being destroyed, etc., etc. Horse meat, fresh meat manages to cure the cases of scurvy that his men were getting. So the French people, again, the peasants especially, didn't have the meat, or didn't have access to vegetables. So French peasants started eating horse meat to cure scurvy because they were getting it as well because of the wartime. And again, it was so horse meat at one time was considered a cure for scurvy. It worked, but it wasn't getting to the point of the matter. Wasn't getting to the cause. And so we skip ahead now to Robert Scott's Antarctic exploration, 1901 to 1904. They caught scurvy. He cured it by giving seal meat to his men, which is like, well, that's sort of weird. Why do you do that? Well, still don't know the cause of it. And by this time, he was thinking that the cause was ptomaine poisoning in the meat they were carrying. Maybe someone got ptomaine poisoning. Maybe the doctor recognized the symptoms of ptomaine poisoning in the early stages of scurvy. It's hard to tell. But I emphasized fresh meat earlier because they were taking salted and dried meats. The vitamin C in the meats was breaking down. So when they thought it was ptomaine poisoning, threw out the old meat, started hunting seal, and it cured them because fresh meat, they were able to get enough vitamin C from the fresh meat to start getting cured. So it was in 1927. Albert Szent-Györgyi, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was a Hungarian doctor, scientist. He isolated hexuronic acid from the adrenal gland. Now, it should be noted that what he called hexuronic acid isn't what we call hexuronic acid today. Modern day hexuronic acid is acids that can be derived from hexose. So what he was calling hexuronic acid is no longer considered hexuronic acid. He suspected that it was an anti-scorbutic agent, which again, that's basically an agent that will prevent scurvy or fight scurvy, but he couldn't prove it. 1932, Charles Glenn King got a sample of hexuronic acid from Albert Szent-Györgyi, and he was able to show by experimentation that hexuronic acid is anti-scorbutic. He renamed it ascorbic acid because it was such a thing, and later we started calling it vitamin C. It was after this that people finally realized that scurvy is being caused by a lack of vitamin C instead of all the other causes we thought were causing it. And that's sort of the main purpose of my starting to look into malnutrition in general, is a lot of diseases which are caused by malnutrition, as we're going to see in a later video, people started looking for something being added. Is there a new bacteria? Is there, what is causing this? And the cause they're looking for is something being added to instead of something being taken away. So, like I said, scurvy was caused by a lack of vitamin C, but they were looking for the cause from something else, from gases in the system, or from bad digestion, or ptomaine poisoning, or other things which mimicked the symptoms of scurvy but weren't the cause of it. And so one of the reasons it took so long to find the cause of scurvy and to actually start more preventive methods of fighting it was that people didn't see the cause as a lack of something. They were looking for something extra, some extra virus, some extra whatever. And so that's all I have to say. I've run longer than I have on most of my videos, so I will end here. I knew Scurvy was going to last longer. Hopefully the next video won't be as long. Thank you for watching, and eat your fruits and vegetables.